Today we have some more actual history from the western frontier of Texas during the days of the Civil War. This episode is again about the kidnapping of Alice Todd by Comanches around the end of 1864. This account is given by one of Alice's classmates from her school in San Saba, Texas, Mrs. Molly Vaughn Winn. This story appeared in the December 11th, 1941 issue of the San Saba News. Mrs. Winn was 88 years old when she told this story. If you watched our first episode on the capture of Alice Todd, then you will notice some details that are different from the account from Frontier Times magazine. After this story, we will read from the book Indian Depredations in Texas, published by J.W. Wilbarger all the way back in 1889. To my knowledge, the story of the capture of Alice Todd does not appear in J.W. Wilbarger's book. However, he lists many other Indian attacks that occurred in San Saba and Llano counties, including the attack on a man named Beardy Hall, who is also mentioned in Mrs. Winn's story about her schoolmate Alice Todd. So here is Mrs. Molly Vaughn Winn's account of Alice Todd's capture. The Menard, Texas News in a recent issue published the following story about the capture by Indians in 1863 of Alice Todd of Mason, Texas. The inside story of how pretty 14-year-old Alice Todd of Mason, Texas, was captured by the Indians late in December 1863 is told at last by a schoolmate of Alice's who is still alive and a prominent citizen of Rock Springs, Texas. She is Mrs. Molly Vaughn Winn, age 88, daughter of the late William J. Vaughn, pioneer settler of Menard County, and founder of the irrigation ditch there. Mrs. Winn recently gave the true facts to her sister, Mrs. Whitty Vaughn Nogues of Menard. Mrs. Winn says no trace was ever found of Alice following her capture in a bitter snowstorm that wintry day out on the hills near Mason. We lived at the time in Brown County on Clear Creek, said Mrs. Winn. We moved a short time afterwards to Menard County. But well do I remember how father and a neighbor, W.C. Dunn, went in an ox-drawn wagon to take me to San Saba, Texas, to place me in the school. They were heavily armed, and on the way we spent the last night with Jack Brown's family who lived on Richland Creek, about where Richland Springs in San Saba County now is located. Next morning we were joined by Beardy Hall, nicknamed Beardy on account of his long beard, which came down to his waist. He rode a beautiful gray horse named Gray John. When we were about 2 miles from San Saba, at that time only a small settlement, Hall left us with the intention of visiting Captain Woods, a friend. He called to us as he rode off, "See you in town." Father warned Mr. Hall of Indians as he was alone and only armed with a six-shooter. Mr. Hall patted his horse on the neck and said, "Gray John will carry me out of all danger." But the Indians killed him before he reached Captain Woods's home. They must have caught him alive as his body was horribly mutilated and showed he had been tortured in a most brutal manner. His head had been scalped in the usual Indian fashion, just a portion of the scalp taken from the top of his head. Father helped bury him. They had long been friends. I was left in school at San Saba. Alice Todd, Martha and Nanny Greenwood, and Maria Crosby, all of Mason County, were there to attend the same school. The teacher was a Mr. Doyle. Alice Todd was about 14 years old. She had a sweet, kind disposition, and I loved her dearly. All of the girls except myself went to their homes to spend the Christmas holidays. The Indians were so bad, Father thought it best for me to stay in San Saba, so he would not have the danger of going for me and taking me back to school after Christmas. When the holidays were over, Mr. Todd and his wife started back to San Saba with Alice to put her in school there. They lived a few miles out of San Saba. Both rode on horseback. Mrs. Todd had a black slave girl riding behind her, and Alice rode behind her father. The Indians suddenly charged upon them, killing the black girl and wounding Mrs. Todd so severely that she died 5 days later. Mr. Todd said when the Indians charged that his horse ran away with him, and that Alice fell off the horse and the Indians captured her. The night after Alice was captured by the Indians, there was a terrible snowstorm that lasted several days. The snow measured 14 inches on the level. R.A. Winn, whom I had not met at the time, but whom I later married, was among those who trailed the Indians. They followed them far beyond where San Angelo now stands. Often they would lose the trail on account of the snow falling so fast. Then they would circle around for miles to find the trail again, which was heading west. At the foot of the Staked Plains, the Indians divided into bands, one going on west, one northwest, and the other southwest. Many strange stories were told about her, but nothing definite was ever known as to what became of this happy schoolgirl. Her father married again and raised a new family, but Alice had a half-brother, Jim Smith, who did everything possible to find her. In fact, he was killed accidentally while gathering wild honey to sell so he could raise more money to carry on the search. At that time, wild bees stored their honey in caves and in hollow trees. An experienced honey gatherer could soon find a barrel of honey, which he could readily sell at Fredericksburg or in San Antonio. Jim Smith, trying to get the honey out of one of these caves, let himself down over a cliff by rope to reach the honey. The rope broke. He fell to the ground many feet below and was killed instantly. He was buried by the side of his mother, and the search for the missing little Alice ended. Whatever became of her will remain a mystery. So that's the end of this article published in the San Saba News back in December of 1941. This account differed from the story in the spring 1961 issue of Frontier Times magazine, in that Mrs. Todd was actually carrying a black slave girl instead of her little son Johnny when they were attacked. The Frontier Times story also said the names of the Todd parents were John and Sarah, but their actual names were George and Dizenia Todd. The Todd Mountain in Mason County is named after them. You can find more information about George Todd's search for his missing daughter in the late 1860s in the book A Fate Worse Than Death by Gregory and Susan Michno. This book was published more recently back in 2007. George Todd implored the state and federal government to help find his daughter Alice. Several times he heard rumors that she had been seen with a tribe, and often that she was the wife of either a Comanche, a Kiowa, or a Mexican, but he received little assistance in his search. This capture occurred around the same time as the capture of Fanny Kelly in Wyoming, and it seems like the federal troops put much more effort into finding Mrs. Kelly than they did towards finding Alice Todd. The story of Alice Todd appears to have been left out of J.W. Wilbarger's 1889 book, Indian Depredations in Texas, but I am now going to read a section from that book that talks about other Comanche attacks that occurred in San Saba and Llano counties around this same time period, including the death of Beardy Hall that was described by Mrs. Winn. Chancey Couch moved to San Saba County in about the year 1858 and resided there until his death. We think it was in the year 1860 that he left his house one morning to go into the woods for board timber. He requested his son to follow him for an hour or so, and by the time he arrived he would have the timber ready for sawing. The son, in obedience to his father's instructions, had started out to join him, and when 2 or 3 miles from home he came across the wagon and oxen, but his father was not with them. After searching well nigh all the day for his father, he discovered late in the afternoon some buzzards collecting at a certain point. Cautiously approaching the spot where the ill-omened birds were congregating, his worst fears were realized when he discovered his father's dead body pierced with arrows, and so mutilated as to be almost beyond recognition. During the year 1862, the Indians killed Ben F. Lynn. Lynn was a young man who belonged to the ranging service. In 1862, he, with Tom Sloan, Ash Feasel, Bill York, and 2 or 3 others, were out cow hunting on Deer Creek in San Saba County. They discovered a body of about 10 Indians. The cow hunters immediately charged upon the Indians, who fled precipitately. A running fight was kept up for several miles, the cowboys firing into the Indians with their 6-shooters, and the Indians shooting back with their bows and arrows. During the chase, young Lynn was shot in the lower part of the body and died a few hours afterward. During the same year, a party of Indians surprised and killed Tom Cabanis on Cherokee Creek. In the fall of 1862, Captain Williams, with a young man whose name was King, and 2 other young men, started from Bluffton with a drove of beeves to take them to Williams Ranch in San Saba County. When not far from Baby Head Mountain in the southern part of San Saba County, Captain Williams left the herd in charge of the 3 young men and rode off in the direction of a spring, saying that he would overtake them in a short time. After driving the beeves a few hundred yards, the young men were startled by wild and savage yells and the clatter of horses' feet in their rear, and upon looking back they saw 8 or 10 Indians charging down upon them. King, who was riding a mule, was on the left of the herd. The other two young men were a little to the right, and ran off to the right of the cattle as fast as their horses would carry them. The last time they saw King, he was vainly trying to get his mule to run. The next day his dead body was found a few hundred yards from where they last saw him. Nearly 1/2 mile further on, the searching party found the dead body of Captain Williams. He had been shot with arrows, and after falling from his horse, the Indians had crushed his head with stones and scalped him. The tracks of Captain Williams' horses showed that he had got nearly to the spring, and then turned and loped back in the direction of the cattle, and passed in a few feet of where King's mule was standing when last seen, and on for about 1/2 mile where his body was found. It is supposed that Williams heard the yelling of the Indians and rushed back to see what was happening, and seeing that King was in danger, he charged down upon the Indians, thinking that he might frighten them away, and depending upon the swiftness of his horse for his safety. Captain Williams was a truly brave man, and he had been of great service to the frontier in protecting it from the raids of the Indian. When killed, he was unarmed, and his death was due, no doubt, to that fact. The father of young King still lives in San Saba County. For several years after the close of the war, the Indians continued their depredations in San Saba County. They killed Beardy Hall in Bowes Woods, in the western part of the county, and a man by the name of Merriman on Jerry's Branch, about 2 miles north of the town of San Saba. The particulars are not at hand. C.C. Carter resided on the headwaters of the Lampasas River about 16 miles north of Lampasas Springs. Sometime in 1865 he made an appointment to visit the house of his son-in-law, distant about 4 miles. When he had arrived within about a mile of his destination, he was fired upon by a party of Indians, who were in ambuscade, awaiting his approach. Although mortally wounded, he put spurs to his horse and fled as fast as possible. The Indians endeavored to intercept him, but failed. He succeeded in reaching his son-in-law's house, but dropped dead at the gate. The daughter ran to his assistance, but too late, as the Indians had accomplished their deadly mission, and Mr. Carter expired in a few moments afterwards. So that's it for this episode, and for this 2-part series on the capture of Alice Todd in Mason County, Texas. As you can see, this was a very dangerous time on the western frontier of Texas. It seems like there was some safety in towns like San Saba, but traveling anywhere in between was extremely perilous. This story is especially interesting to me because my grandmother was born in San Saba, Texas in 1920, and her great-grandfather, Hampton Wade Marley, settled in San Saba County in 1856. He was in Tom Green's cavalry regiment during the Civil War, and he may have returned home by mid-1864, after Tom Green was killed on April 12th of that year, during the Red River Campaign. This channel is called Unworthy History because we present actual history that is now shunned and deemed unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV. If you'd like to help keep actual history alive, then consider joining our Patreon page or becoming a YouTube channel member. Your contribution will be recognized at the end of each episode, and you will also have access to members-only videos. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.